All right. Happy Thursday. Happy Thursday, everyone. Come on in for some midday inspiration. This is your host, Christal Jordan, and you guys are probably used to seeing me in the evenings with Reality Check, but we have a very special program for you guys today. I'm really excited about it. This young lady is, to me, a voice of her generation. We hear a lot about generational curses and how that can be so horrible, but we often don't celebrate generational blessings. And this young lady is an example of that. She, of course, is the daughter of one of the most notable pastors and motivational speakers of our time. And Sarah Jakes has her own very unique voice. Like I said, I consider her one of the voices of our time. She is here with some midday inspiration for you all with her new book, Woman Evolve. Please help me welcome the very beautiful, the very charismatic Sarah Jakes Roberts.
Hi, Christal. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. Thank you. We are excited. Sometimes I think, there's so much going on in our world today. I think more than ever, it feels like. And so inspiration is always needed. And I'm so excited about this book. I had a chance to read most of it. And it's already a New York Times bestseller. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you. That was exciting news.
So the book is titled Woman Evolve, Break Up with Your Fears and Revolutionize Your Life. Where did that come from?
I was studying in the Bible. I study a lot because I share my story with so many women, and then I like to share, just biblical support for whatever it is we're discussing. And I was studying all of these women in the Bible, but I kept getting drawn back to Eve for some reason. And I started realizing that as much as she's vilified, as much as she's unappreciated, that there is this story that we don't really tell about Eve that happens after she eats from the forbidden fruit. And I realized that though Eve knew better but didn't do better, that I could relate to her more than any other woman in the Bible because I knew better and didn't do better. But what I saw was how God helped her to pick up her life and really revolutionize it after that forbidden fruit. And I just felt like if I could rescue Eve, I could rescue any other woman who's been like Eve. And so Woman Evolve are the steps that I noticed that she took in order to change her life.
When I was reading, I thought that was so interesting because number one, I've heard that saying. My grandmother used to say that when you know better, you'll do better. And so, especially as women, we think there's a sense of guilt because sometimes you do things that you do know better, that you weren't supposed to do. So that was the first thing. And then just the idea of Eve, because I think, you mentioned how we all kind of think about, oh my God, she's responsible for everything. From periods to cramps to pain and childbirth, everything goes back to Eve. And I wondered, do we blame, a lot of times as women, we blame ourselves for our own, mistakes and don't forgive ourselves, much like we've never really forgiven Eve.
When I tell you that is spot on, because I feel like, how can we practice forgiveness to ourselves if we have a difficult time forgiving others? And if I took this woman who, like, universally, whether you are a person of faith or not, everyone is like, Eve did us wrong out here. And yet so much of womanhood, I think, has a lot to do with how we relate to the women who we are connected to. And I felt like if I could really dissect her life and understand what it was like to be her, that maybe I could help people become more compassionate with their own Eve moments when they knew better and didn't do better.
Absolutely. There's so much. This book is so good. You all definitely have to pick it up. And I think it relates not just to women, but to men also, because, there's this point where for most of us where we feel we allow our mistakes or our inability to conquer certain things in our life to become the thing that holds us back because we don't forgive ourselves. We start to condemn ourselves. And especially, in the church, especially when you grow up with so many expectations and, very, very strict consequences and all of that. Can you talk? I mean, for those of us that were in the church is one thing, but for your experience growing up as a pastor's child and then a pastor of, like TD Jakes, I can't imagine how mistakes were not really allowed. And then if you did make one, I'm sure you, judged yourself almost probably more harshly than others did as well. Can you talk about how to get rid of that self-condemnation?
Yeah, Crystal, that's so good because I think to your point, when I look back at my life, I wonder how many of the moments of shame that held me back were self-inflicted versus coming from outside circles and communities. I've shared my story so many times about getting pregnant as a teenager. I was 13 years old when I got pregnant. I was 14 when I had my son. I was just so young and so broken and so lost and looking for an identity. And I thought that I could do something to make me fit in. And so I ended up pregnant and I just couldn't get over the fact that that happened. And people would tell me like, oh my gosh, you're so smart later down. And I would be like, well, smart girls don't get pregnant. I could not get over this fact that I ended up in this circumstance. And one of the things that really helped me in my journey to healing was to stop being so judgmental and dare to love the version of myself that ended up in that situation. Having empathy for ourselves, I feel like is one of the keys to self-condemnation. When we look back on our lives, we see the fruit of what we did, but we don't always look at the root. And I feel like if we looked at the root, we'll see that most of the time we were doing the best we could with what we had. We were lost, insecure, confused, and we made an action, but we understand the heart behind what took place. And I think we're able, Mary J. Blige says that she's mothering herself. We're able to mother ourselves, parent ourselves out of that brokenness into the light of what wisdom has taught us as a result of what we've gone through.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you that you shared a story in the book about, kind of like you said, following where that came from. I made some mistakes, but where'd that come from? And you talked about being 7 years old and you guys changing and going from a smaller church to this bigger church. Obviously your father's career was starting to take off and you weren't allowed to sit with your parents anymore. You weren't allowed to sit right next to your mother. And that made you feel that provided trauma because you're like, wait a minute, I'm in this 1,500 people here and I'm not in that safe space. Do you think that people, especially, I have to say, especially women, a lot of times, we don't know where some of that behavior comes from. What was your journey to figuring out what made you make that decision and start looking for love and acceptance in other places?
Crystal, I really felt like almost like that moment in my life was so trivial because you look back at it as an adult and you're like, big deal. You couldn't sit with your parents. And I even felt a little just vulnerable in sharing that story. But I feel like the fact that it even stood out in my mind was a sign that it did shift something in my world. So to your point, we moved to Dallas, 1,500 people joined the church that first Sunday. I was used to sitting right next to my mom, like so many people who grew up going to church. But that moment, she ends up on the pulpit and we're sitting down in the crowd with our siblings, but a sea full of strangers. And I just felt so isolated from them. And so I think that one of the things we have to do as women, as we kind of try and figure out what is the root of this search for love, search for validation, search for acceptance, is we have to give ourselves permission to let the small things be big things. I think especially sometimes in our community, we're like, that ain't no big deal. And we see other people's stories and the trauma they've experienced. And we're like, so maybe mine wasn't a big deal. But if it's still in your heart, if it's still carrying with you even into your adulthood, I do think that we have to determine what are the thoughts, what are the feelings, what are the emotions that were birthed out of that moment, and how did I end up remedying them, or did I? Because maybe that's the reason why I keep finding myself in cycles.
Mm-hmm. There is that, going back to that statement of, when you know better, you do better. There's this idea, and I know especially in the African American community, where when a woman is making bad decisions, particularly in relationships with men, it's like, oh, she's stupid, she knows better. I'm gonna leave her alone because she knows better than that. My grandmother used to say, when you get enough, you'll stop.
Yeah.
And that's not always true. How can we as sisters, mothers, daughters, aunts, and just overall sisters start to support each other and change that narrative? Because a lot of it, I think, does come from church. A lot of it may be cultural, but the idea that if someone is making mistakes, they know better, they deserve to stay in that mess is really toxic. And I think it's especially in our community as African American women, we have to change that. How do we start?
I think that we have to realize that when we are condemning someone, making a judgment about someone, that we are adding poison to an already toxic situation.
Mhm.
What I have found when I'm talking to women about being in difficult relationships that they can't find their way out of, that it's not that they don't know better. It's not that they don't feel like they deserve better. They just literally feel trapped. Like, I don't know how to stop this. And I don't know who I will become as a result of it. I feel like as women that we have a responsibility to be sensitive and gentle with another woman's heart. And I do feel like it's easier to cast judgment when we haven't processed our own actions, because the truth is, if you see someone struggling, there ought to be something in you that can relate to a certain extent. There, but by the grace of God, I would have gone that path as well. And so to empathize with that woman with loving kindness, we can draw her into a safe space where she maybe feels comfortable enough to say, well, this is why I can't leave, and this is what I'm afraid of. And then we can help navigate them to a safer relationship and a more whole version of themselves. But we can't stab them and heal them at the same time.
Right. Absolutely. Well, if you guys are just joining us, this is our midday motivation. We're doing something special with the very beautiful, very talented, very charismatic Sarah Jakes Roberts. She's here with her new book, Woman Evolve. You definitely need to get this book. It's a great read, and I think appeals to women. It's going to appeal to women across ages. You mentioned your blessing often feeling like it turns into a burden, and I could definitely relate to that. So many women are doing, you get an opportunity for your career, you get into a relationship, and you feel like this is my blessing, and then a few months down the road, the job is overwhelming, you don't feel like you're performing well, and it feels like a burden. That blessing that was a husband is getting on your last nerve. And it feels like a burden. So how do we juxtapose that, something that we do know is something we prayed for and is a blessing from God, but we're not maybe measuring up, and now all of a sudden it feels like a burden?
I think it's really important that we give people permission to express the fact that, you know what, this was a blessing, but there are also some difficulties connected to it as well. A lot of times when we see someone with a life that we think is like so beautiful and then they complain about it, we're like, girl, I wish I had this, or girl, I wish I had that going. But that doesn't take away the fact that there are moments when it's difficult. And so I do think giving women permission, giving yourself permission to say this is a blessing and sometimes it's hard too, is the first step. Those two truths can live in the same house. It's a blessing, and I'm having to challenge myself to wrap my arms around the blessing. I'm having to stretch and confront my childhood issues to really step into this blessing. I think once we have appreciation for the fact that we're living in the truth that both of those things exist at the same time, that then we're also able to have gratitude and strategy come at the same place. That's kind of what I wanted to talk about in the book. It doesn't mean that there's now no need for change. It doesn't mean that you have to silence yourself and just take it, but you're able to communicate better when you see your life through the lens of this is a blessing. And so even if I have to leave the job, even if I need to make some changes in the marriage, I can communicate it in a way that still honors that it is a blessing, but also challenges everyone around it to grow and rise to the level of the blessing that is in front of us.
That's true. That's a big point that I think a lot of people can really, really relate to. You also talked about, resources and feeling like we don't, a lot of times we get discouraged and maybe we just haven't asked the right questions, or we haven't done the research ourselves. Can you talk a little bit about how people can feel overwhelmed in situations, and really they're looking at the big picture. They haven't looked at it individually. So how have you managed to do that? And what advice do you have for people that are just in a situation where they feel completely overwhelmed and inadequate right now?
Man, I have to tell you, so I had this revelation about Eve, which I thought was so powerful. I wanted every woman to know it in any capacity that I could share it with her. And so I was like, let's have a conference. And we set up registration, and people have started, getting their tickets to come to the conference. And instantly I realized, like, I dropped out of college. I don't have any skills in accounting. I don't know much about budgeting and putting things together. And people are entrusting their resources for this environment that I said that I could create, instantly I started feeling overwhelmed. Instantly I started feeling over my head. And it would have been so easy for me to say, you know what, this is a bad idea. I quit. I'm going to give folks their money back and I'm going to just use social media so that I don't have to level up in this way. What I decided to do instead was to dare to get on Google and let Google be my university, to learn what type of accounting software is available, to understand the implications of starting an organization, what's important. I say that to say is a lot of times we are, some of us are educated, some of us have educated ourselves through the school of hard knocks. Whatever it is, though, don't allow the fact that you don't have the resources to make you believe that you still can't build the vision. It just means where some people are using wood, you got to use something else. You got to use brick. You got to use metal. There are so many resources available online if we dare to not see our limitations as the limit, but rather just an opportunity to grow and stretch ourselves so that we can still fulfill the mandate that God has placed on our lives.
I like that. I want to invite people, if you guys have questions, we do have Miss Jakes Roberts here for a few more minutes. So I want to invite you to ask your questions. Just, reading this book and watching your story, because I kind of watched you grow up. Did you ever consider at the time that you were in your that 13-year-old, because, a 13-year-olds are, not only are they going through hormonal differences, and then you also are on a platform where your parents have a lot going on. There's a lot of eyes on you. Did you ever see yourself walking in your father's footsteps and preaching and teaching? And how did you get from that 13-year-old that felt a little displaced to this powerhouse that is empowering others in the very same way that she probably watched her father do years ago?
It's still kind of crazy to wrap my mind around the fact that I ended up following in my dad's footsteps because I wasn't looking for his footsteps to even follow them. I started blogging. I was going through a divorce and I was just trying to get to the root of why I ended up making so many toxic decisions. And at the end of this blog, I would just pray for myself as if I was just a friend on the outside. I was really trying to encourage myself. And people started gravitating to the blog and they were saying it was helping them and that it had given them strength. And I started feeling like, okay, so this is ministry. This is ministry. And when I accepted it, that it was ministry, I just started asking and submitting myself to God in such a way where it's like, whatever you want to do, however you want to use me, I'll do it, because there is nothing like seeing your wounds turn to wisdom for someone else. And I felt like I spent all of this time carrying the scars of my insecurities, the scars of my broken past. And now all of a sudden, God was using my scars as a balm for someone else's wounds. And I feel like that's what ministry is in its purest form. It's not even about a platform. It's not even about preaching or even worship leading. I think that those are capacities in which you can be in ministry. But I think ministry in its purest form is as showing the areas of our life where God's strength was made perfect in our weakness. And we can be in ministry and friendships and relationship and connection with our coworkers. We don't have to have a platform to do it.
That's important, because I think, I mentioned when we first started that I think your father definitely was a voice for his generation, but I think that generation is very different. And I think people's needs are different. The way people communicate is different. And we look at church different. There are a lot of people, I talk to people every day that are very turned off or just don't feel that they connect to that old idea of church. And so reading this book, I'm very familiar with the story of Eve, but I feel like even if people did not grow up, in church and knowing all those biblical stories, you've managed to take something and make it very relatable. How important, is that? Because I think that there are a lot of people, like I said, that are just not, they have no concept of that old school church that you grew up in, but you're able to still reach them. How important is that to you?
It's really important, I feel, and I hope that generations are beginning to wrap their mind around this concept. But I feel like the church felt like for a long time we had to have the answer to everyone's life. And if we didn't have to have the answer, then we just told them to sit down until we figured it out, or maybe didn't figure it out at all. And I feel like we're now in a generation where it's like, if church doesn't have the answer, there are communities. Listen, there is Google. There are opportunities for me to feel connected to and related to outside of the four walls of the church. And then there's already such a tragic representation of what it means to be a person in ministry and a person in church that I feel like has really tainted people's perspective as well. And so I think people need space to be on a journey, figuring it out on their own. That church has to come to a place where we feel like I don't have to have the answers. My only job is to try to get you to God. That's how I feel about myself. Like my only job is to get you into the presence of God. I let him figure out how you're supposed to be living, what you're supposed to be doing, what you're not supposed to be doing. I don't want to be your master. I don't want to be your ruler. I want to be a fellow person on a journey trying to figure this thing out. And I think it is that level of relatability that gives people permission to say, listen, she doesn't have it all together. He doesn't have it all together. But together, maybe we can figure out the perfect path, the perfect theology that God has for our individual journeys.
I like that feeling of it not being a collective thing, it being a very individual relationship with God that is able to touch other people. You mentioned going through a divorce. That is one of the things that, I mean, you know, these are huge things that a lot of us have gone through that leave you with a feeling of failure, kind of like a personal, I know for myself, that was probably the biggest failure of my life, was going through divorce and feeling like, oh my gosh, this is a huge mark. I probably was doing, like you said, and putting a lot more judgment on myself than even other people were, because divorce just is like that social, you know, failure on your life. How did you manage to go through that? Because it is a very painful process. And then to find, you know, forgiveness, healing, forgiveness, and then to be able to open your heart and fall in love all over again, and to have another love story without that scarring and tainting of the divorce that you went through.
You know, I really had to understand why I ended up in the marriage and why the marriage shifted, and then why I had to leave the marriage. By understanding it, I mean, like I really had to come to a place where I embraced the person who was in the marriage and embraced this situation that caused us to end up leaving the marriage as it was. It's really difficult, even if you have like all of the right reasons to leave. To your point, this is something like you're single, married, or divorced, right? You check that box forever until you move into something different. And it's difficult to feel like you're forever labeled with that. But I think to understand, like, what does this communicate to me about my intentions, about my heart posture? And I think coming to a place where you're like, you know what, I did the best that I could with what I had to work with. This is what I had. And it's not what I wanted for my life. And most importantly, my husband and I, on our very first date, we sat down and we talked about what divorce taught me about marriage. What is the new vision connected to my life as it relates to relationships and marriage that I know now because of the way that marriage didn't work out? So it really takes like dissection on a personal level as far as opening my heart, because I kind of came to a place where I realized what I needed out of the relationship and what I needed out of the marriage. I understood what was standing in front of me when my husband came into my face. Now, when other things came into my face, I was like, I already did that. I divorced it. I can't do it again. But when my husband was standing in front of my face, I was like, this feels like what God told me I could have as a part of my journey if I was willing to do the work.
Wow. We have a question. Mrs. Small says, how can I serve at a church that has become a toxic environment for me and caused to the point where I'm having anxiety attacks? And I think that's something I'm sure a lot of people in churches can relate to, when the environment has become toxic, but you're trying to do your due diligence and serve God and still be of service in the church. How do you manage those two? And it's funny because in the book you said you cannot go to heaven, you cannot be petty in heaven. So
that's true.
Is coming on you, but you have to figure out how to not be petty in that space. But what advice would you give someone dealing with that?
I would say you got to leave. I know that this is not like what everyone wants to hear, but I think the idea of I'm going to stay even though it's toxic is the reason why so many of us don't end up getting the healing that we need from church. Church is not the place where we come to prove that God has been good to us and that we are worthy of God's love. It's not necessarily even a place where everyone has to come in order to prove that they are in relationship with God. I feel like the first role of the church is to bring you closer to God. And if you're in a church where you feel like this is toxic and actually pulling me away from God, then God is not smiling when you walk into those doors. God's heart could be breaking when when he sees you continue to be abused and in a toxic environment. And so your soul, your spirit, the health of your soul and spirit has to be the number one priority. That may mean you got to join Bedside Baptist for a little bit. That means you may not be able to serve, but you can come on Sundays. But you have to see your heart and your soul as number one priority, because that is what God is looking like. And then when you're healthy, then when you're at a place where you can add a value to a church, then I believe that you get involved and you can serve in a way that makes you feel comfortable. But we've got so many toxic people in leadership, not just in the church, I think in the world in general, but I think in the church in particular. If we know we're in a toxic situation, that we have a responsibility to make sure that we don't validate or endorse the toxicity of that environment with our presence.
Absolutely. You mentioned in the book when people are in overwhelming circumstances or they're in a rut, be it their job, their marriage, it could be a friendship, a relationship with parents. What are some God goals? What is the definition of God goals that we can apply to our lives to try to kind of restructure or reformat or, get on another path and accomplish, being our best self? So what is your definition of God's goals for us individually?
Man, God goes, first of all, I believe like when it comes to purpose, which has become such this like nebulous term, everyone's trying to figure out like, what is my purpose and how do I know if I'm in it? I believe that our number one purpose is to be a representation of heaven on earth, which means that I don't necessarily have to wait until I figure out if I need to write a book or if I'm supposed to be a singer to be in purpose. Every day that I wake up, I have an opportunity to represent heaven on earth. When that becomes the God goal in our relationship and our job opportunities, then we're able to plan out a little bit better, like how I want to show up in the world and what keeps me from showing up in the world that way, because I may need boundaries in order to facilitate the ability for me to show up as God's presence on the earth. I wanted to talk about goals because I think a lot of times we think about short-term goals, long-term goals, but I also wanted to dare to make us think about generational goals. When the Bible says to be fruitful and multiply, that multiplication implies that there's generational goals connected to how we show up in the earth today. I like to wake up with this idea of like how my decisions today are going to affect my great grandchildren down the road. And I don't even mean like as it relates to finances, though I do believe that it's ideal for us to leave finances for our children and an inheritance. But I mean, what do I want my family to know about mental health? What do I want my family to understand about communication and emotional wellness? Those are the type of God goals that changes who we are on the inside. And then whatever we get to leave that is material is just icing on the cake. But I want to change the spirit of my family. I want to change the definition of womanhood. And I think that we all have an opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. Well, I definitely agree with that. And I love the fact that you specify, because a lot of times people assume when you think of legacy and leaving something, they're only thinking about the finances. And it's like, no, we want to change the internal culture of our family. We want to be able to nurture and realize, okay, that affected me and my mom and my grandmother. So we want to stop that. So my daughter doesn't deal with that and her daughter doesn't deal with that. It's so much more than just money and giving, finances. But this book, I love this book. And I really do. I think that when I initially saw it, I was like, well, maybe this is going to relate to, millennials, but the principles in here relate to everybody, women, men, everyone. So I want to ask you, what is the message that you hope everybody that picks up a copy of this book leaves with when they finish reading it?
Christal, I love what you said about a lot of times we just think about financial inheritance and not that inner wellness, that inner culture that we want to create for our families, because I feel like when we think in that way, that it takes the pressure off of performance and allows us to focus on being, which is so important when we look at revolutionizing our soul. My prayer with this book is that people would come into the knowledge that the revolution is closer than it appears, and that it doesn't have anything to do with the amount of money that is in your bank account. It has nothing to do with whether you are married or single. It has everything to do with how you come to a place on the inside that allows you to reach ahead for what God has for you. And so my goal, my prayer prayer is that when people read this book, that they'll realize the work can be delicate, it can be vulnerable, sometimes it can make you feel fragile, but in the process of doing the work, there's also confidence, strength, peace, and joy that cannot be taken away based on your circumstance. The revolution is closer than it appears, and it can start today if you're ready.
It can start today. I got to ask you one last question because I had a chance to spend some time with Iyanla Van Zandt, and she talks a lot about women operating from their head, right? And in your head, there's all this noise going on, but really it's like in your heart, and you talk in the book about the fact that a lot of times we know, and there's an inner voice that we're just not listening to. I mean, we may not even realize it's there. How do you tap into, how can people, especially women, tap into that confidence in them that's there that they may no longer be in connection with? I thought that was so powerful because there's so many times that we don't give ourselves credit because so focused on looking at others and doing all that. So how can we tap into that version of ourselves that does believe in ourselves, that does know that God, has placed this gift within me, that confident woman? How do we get in touch with her?
I really feel like in the book that this is the difference between self-care and soul care. Self-care are those things that we do, like we're getting our nails done, we're maybe going for a run, we're exercising because we want to take care of our body. But soul care is when we allow ourselves to quiet the noise, to become one with our breath, to acknowledge the presence of God. And then from that place, to bring one worry at a time into that presence, into that oneness, and allow what we know to be illuminated. We'll say things like, even in a toxic relationship, it's like, I think I need to leave. I think he's cheating on me. I think that this is making me worse, but I don't know. That's not true, sis. You do know. But there is a fear connected to activating what you know. And I believe that the activation of what we know comes down to being one enough with our soul to say, I'm afraid of being lonely. I'm afraid that this may be my only chance at love. And then to then ask ourselves, if this is my only chance at love, is this how I want love to be defined in my life? But that comes from a place of really being intimate with oneself. And I wanted to really stress that in the book, because if you don't know how to be intimate within yourself, to know your heart, know your soul, know your fears, know your stresses and anxieties, then how can we be intimate? Is certainly in our relationship with God or with others.
Very true. Well, thank you so much. If you guys haven't gotten enough, we gave you a lot with this interview. Definitely need to go pick up your copy of Woman Evolve. Again, thank you so much, Sarah Jakes Roberts, for spending this time. Is there you give people where they can find out more about the book, and where that, if you are going to have that conference, we definitely want our listeners to know all about that.
Absolutely. You can follow Woman Evolve on all of the socials, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and then you can go to womanevolve.com and learn about all of the resources we have available for women who are on a journey to become the best version of themselves. Certainly we have the book, but there are podcasts and courses, all types of things that may be helpful to you on your journey.
Absolutely. Thank you again so much. You all go to womanevolve.com. From everyone here at Rolling Out, we're so proud of your journey. We continue to support you and look forward to what's coming next.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. All right. Well, I appreciate you guys for hanging out for a little midday inspiration. That the book is amazing. Like I said, I had a chance to read it and actually spend some time looking at some of the exercises. I know it's going to bless you. So make sure you get your copy of Woman Evolve, and make sure you tune in for more. If you want to rerun this, share this interview so it can help some other people. And of course, you'll be able to see more on the site rollingout.com. This has been your host, Christal Jordan, blessing you with a little midday inspiration. I'll see you guys as usual on Friday for a recap from Ready to Love, and again on Monday at 8 o'clock for Reality Check. Enjoy the rest of your week.